Today's scripture reading comes from John chapter 20, verses 24 to 29. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples were saying to him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands imprint of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." After 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors having been shut, and stood in their midst and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach here with your finger and see my hands, and reach here with your hand and put it into my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believing." Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Because you have seen me, have you believed? Blessed are they who do not see and yet believed." This is the word of God.
You know, today in our education department, it was Transition Sunday, so all the students that graduated moved up into their new grade, and I'm wondering, do we have any new grads in the room here today? Yay! Congratulations. I know we have some college graduates. Hopefully we have some high school students that are now starting their college years. Welcome to third service. This is where all the action is in our church and all the fun. It's so good to have you guys here. Today, I want to start with this question. Do you believe in miracles? Like, do you honestly believe in them? Like, as you know of and you continue to expect God-given miracles in your life. And I think most of you would probably say yes, right? I do believe in miracles. And I myself would say the same. And if I were to ask you, how many miracles have you seen in your life? You would probably say, I'm not sure, right? Isn't all of life a miracle? Isn't me passing my AP class, maybe calculus with an A miracle? Isn't getting that amazing dream job that I've been desiring and praying for my life, my whole life, a miracle? Maybe it's getting into that dream college that you've always been wanting to go to. That's a miracle in and of itself. One of the most famous lines in all of sports, it's way before your time. It's in 1980. There's a gentleman by the name of Al Michaels. It's in a hockey game during the Olympics, and the U.S. beats Russia in the semifinals, and the classic line is, "Do you believe in miracles?" Because you may not know this, but it was the greatest sports upset of all time. The U.S. had beaten Russia in ice hockey, and then the U.S. went on to win a gold medal. It was just one of the greatest moments, and that's one of the most famous lines in all of sports history. You can look that up. And those are generally examples of miracles, right, when we talk about miracles. But that's not exactly, right? That's not exactly what I'm talking about when I ask the question, do you believe in miracles? And I'm not thinking about these like extraordinary events that happen in our life, right? These things that happen, they become unexpected. They're miracles nonetheless, but not the kind that I'm talking about. Because by miracle, I'm talking about those contrary to human possibility events, right? That absent God intervening or God doing something, it would not be possible, right? A miracle of all miracles, right? Because in the realm of your own possibilities, it's something that you would never think could possibly actually happen. And now when I ask you that, maybe you're thinking, okay, I'm pretty sure I believe in those kind of miracles too, but maybe you're a little bit more uncertain, or you're kind of struggling to come up with things that may come to mind that fit that. Because by definition, these miracles, they don't happen all the time, right? This isn't something that we see all the time. And when they do happen in our lives, it becomes very hard to believe and hard to understand. So we try to justify it or explain it in some other way or in some other manner because we don't understand how that could possibly happen, right? Even in your own life, this may have happened, and you've experienced some kind of miracle like that. In my own personal life, I've definitely experienced a miracle of all miracles. Like that, it's something that's personally happened to me. And the greatest example of that, the biblical example of that, is the resurrection of Jesus, right? The resurrection of Jesus is actually the miracles of all miracles. Hands down, it's the biggest thing that has happened, in the events of world history, right? Because it's totally unexplainable. It's totally incomprehensible by any stretch of your imagination. There is no way that you could understand it. And that's probably why we don't talk about it that much, right? Generally, it's the topic, obviously, at Easter, but outside of Easter, it's not something that we regularly share about, even when we're talking about our faith in a day-to-day capacity. Because I think often it's hard. It's hard to really understand it and explain it to somebody. Like, you can understand the crucifixion, right? You understand that Jesus died. But after 3 days, rising from the dead is a completely different thing, and it's hard to explain. So I ask that question again. Do you believe in miracles? Especially in this miracle, right? In this miracle, the resurrection of Jesus. And I ask that a little bit tongue-in-cheek because I'm assuming that most of you in this room do believe that. That's why you're sitting here today, right? But sometimes there's miracles in our lives that we're wondering if will ever happen, right? We're questioning some of the circumstances of our own lives and the challenges that we go through. And often that leads to doubt, right? There's doubt in our hearts, in our minds, in our spirits, sometimes because of the circumstances that we are in. That leads me to this question. Can you guys think of any doubters in the Bible? Like, of course, we're going to be talking about Thomas. He's probably the most famous doubter of all time. But in my opinion, and as I'll share today, Thomas gets a bad rap, right? He gets stuck with this moniker of doubting Thomas. And in my opinion, it's kind of a bad statement to couple him with, right? Because in the Bible, it's not just Thomas that doubts, right? There's doubters actually everywhere. Everybody doubts. Think about it. Everybody going through the Bible, you see at some point has doubted. And I'm talking about Adam and Eve. I'm talking about Abraham and Sarah, David, Elijah, Moses. Every figure that you see in the Bible at some point struggled with doubt in their heart. Right? Even Jesus' own family, right? His family, they had some serious doubts, right? He's walking around talking about he's the Messiah, and they're like, yeah, not so much, right? We don't think so. His own disciples, after he's crucified, they doubt that he's going to resurrect. So they all disperse, right? It's not just Thomas that's in this place, because there's doubters everywhere. There's doubters everywhere in the Bible, but you have to understand the best part of it, that God doesn't give up on the doubters. And I want to encourage you, he doesn't give up on us either as we sit in our doubt. Because God didn't ask us to pretend and to try to manufacture any kind of certainty in our lives. It's not something that he's asking us, right? He accepts us where we are. He accepts that we would struggle with the doubt and sometimes the lack of faith. But all he's asking for is us to have some faith and to be able to step forward in that, right? And to work through the doubt, work through the challenges, and work through the struggles and the questions that we may have. There were a lot of people on that first Sunday, that Easter Sunday after the crucifixion, that really doubted what Jesus had been teaching them every step of the way, right? Peter, James, Matthew, Bartholomew, all of them. It wasn't just Thomas that struggled with it, right? But I'm going to focus on Thomas today because he is the one with the moniker, right? He is doubting Thomas. And I want to share with you that Thomas is much more than someone that just had doubt in his heart. And it starts here in John 20, 24 to 25, right? He says something pretty crazy, right? He says, unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails and put my finger into the place of the nails and put my hand into its side, I will not believe. That's a pretty dramatic statement, right? He wants concrete evidence, like solid proof that this is the risen Jesus. And I focus on Thomas because I think many of us, I would even say most of us in this room, are more like Thomas than we'd like to believe, right? The thought that you need this proof, this concrete evidence, something that really says, yeah, this is true, I can lean on this. It's not a secondhand story. It's not something that someone else is telling me. I think it's something that we all want, right? Because that gives us this certainty. That gives us this understanding of that truth that we want to believe in, right? Because I think on some level, all of us are skeptics, right? We all have this natural inclination to want proof, like concrete proof in concrete evidence. As many of you guys know, before I was a pastor, I was an attorney, right? And part of my job was to find this type of evidence for my clients, right? My clients were not liable or guilty or not guilty because of something I said or because I believed it to be true. My job was to hunt down the evidence, find the facts, find everything that points to the fact that they weren't liable, and to give that proof, right? I had to prove that by a preponderance of the evidence. I couldn't just say it. I couldn't just tell them, oh, this is why, right? You have to show them with the evidence. And I think that's kind of the human nature that we're inclined to, and some of the things that we believe, and that's why we want that proof, when we want that kind of certainty of truth. And that's why I say that many of us, right, are so much like Thomas, right? But Thomas, like I said, is more than just his doubt, right? He's actually a man of conviction. And it's unfortunate that he's remembered in this negative light because there's more to him than the doubt. He first steps on the biblical stage here in John chapter 11. In this passage, Lazarus has died in Bethany, and it's this suburb of Jerusalem. Jesus is with the disciples. They're in the Jericho area, and they get word. And when Jesus hears about Lazarus, he's like, let's go. Let's go to him and let's see. And then the disciples are like, you remember the last time we were in Judea? They tried to stone you to death. We're not welcome there. Our people are not welcome there. People that follow you are not welcome. But Jesus decides to go anyway. And the disciples are still unconvinced. But there's only one at this point, and it's Thomas that speaks out. He says, let us also go so that we may die with him. In that brief statement, it reveals so much more about who Thomas actually is, right? Thomas understood that the Jewish leaders would try to persecute them, would try to stone them, would try to kill them, even imprison them. In the events that soon follow, obviously prove him correct. But what does that say? What does that say about a man that says, if they kill him, they're going to have to come through me, that I will die with him, right? It takes a man of real conviction, of truth, of really holding on to something, right? We see in Thomas that there is a love and a dedication and a closeness to Jesus. And I think Thomas actually understood better than any other disciple what was about to happen to Jesus. And in that, we see why he has his doubts later. Because he actually understands the gravity of the moment. And then Jesus, being who he is, right? Thomas is the one that appears one more time before the crucifixion. And in that late Thursday night, in the upper room, right, Jesus washes the feet of the disciples, and he gives them one more command, right? He tells them to love one another, right? This is kind of the stage before his crucifixion and what is happening. Judas now leaves the room because he's going to go do whatever he was going to do to turn Jesus in. And then the rest of the disciples, right? Jesus is talking to them and he's explaining all these things that are going to happen. They crowd around him. In his last moments, he tells them, right? Do not let your heart be troubled, because if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself. And there where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way where I am going. It says, you know the way where I am going. I don't think they knew, right? They don't really know at this point where Jesus is going. Thomas is sitting there. He's quietly listening, intently focused. And all this is like, this coming and going. It's confusing. There's a lot of information. He has no idea what's going on. Jesus is being a little bit vague, mysterious. And in this great moment of honesty, right? In this great moment that Thomas has in his honesty, he says, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How do we know the way? Those are the words of a totally honest man, right? He doesn't know. He wants to understand, so he's asking Jesus the question, right? In that moment, it's a moment of truth that he has because he has no understanding of what Jesus is talking about. You ever been in a situation like that? Where you're in a conversation, maybe with somebody or in a group of people, and the conversation's so over your head that you just sit and nod, and you're like, yeah, of course, sure. But you have no idea. And maybe it's so over your head that you don't even know a good question to ask. So you can't even ask any questions because you don't want to ask a stupid question. I've been in many situations like that, right? Where you're just like, it's beyond me and beyond my own comprehension. Like you can't be in that place though, right? To not ask, to not get clarity, to not understand what is being conveyed. Because clarity is so important, right? It allows us to function. It allows us to go about doing what somebody's explaining to us, right? Oftentimes, like I probably should do it more when my wife is telling me something, to clarify, to understand. That's a better way of communication, right? And Thomas was not that guy to just let that moment pass. He wasn't just going to let that pass. And he's like, no, Jesus, we don't know the way. What are you talking about? And that's a second key into Thomas's actual personality, right? He is this independent thinker, a thoughtful man, right? Not easily overrun by public opinion. And he's willing to actually dig deeper. He's willing to dig deeper to understand, to struggle through things, the challenges, so he can actually know what is going on, right? And I think that was why he had this difficulty to make a confession of faith, just to understand and know that Jesus has risen. He wanted to see for himself, right? He wanted to know and understand for himself. And I think sometimes it's easier to have a shallow faith or a faith where you're just saying, yeah, I'll believe it because I have this childlike faith and I can believe it. But oftentimes, the more you struggle with something and the more you're challenging through it and the more you're wrestling through it, that doubt, when you can convert that into the truth of your life, it becomes so much stronger and it becomes so much more cemented into your life. And I think that's a place that we all ought to get to as much as we can, right? So we see this real picture of Thomas, right? On the eve of the crucifixion, we see that he's actually this brave man, intensely loyal and deeply committed to Jesus. And if need be, he was ready and willing to lay down his life, right? He struggled through some of the doubts and the fears that he had. And he wasn't going to be satisfied, right, with secondhand answers or things that didn't really make sense to him. And he was going to question things, like legitimately question them. Not just to ask the questions, but to truly understand and know exactly what is happening. And ultimately, this sets the stage for the greatest crisis of Jesus' life, of Thomas's life. And I think oftentimes, like we see it as the big picture. We understand and we know it. And maybe you've grown up in the church, and you heard it enough, and you know that Jesus was crucified and that he resurrected on the third day. It's something that it's easier for us to believe. We have the benefit of the Bible, we have the benefit of the church, we have the benefit of commentary, of all these things that help us along. But think about it in that moment, in real time. All those people on that Sunday after Jesus was crucified. Like, you have to ask yourself, if you were there, would you have absolutely believed it if someone told you? Or would you have also had doubts? Or put it another way, what would it take for you to be convinced that someone had risen from the dead? Every objectable piece of evidence that you have says, no, he's died, right? He's died. Like if you had been there, in Jerusalem? What would it have taken for you to actually believe and to fully understand? In answering that question, it helps us to remember how those who knew Jesus best actually reacted to the news of the resurrection. Do you guys know that they weren't expecting it? They weren't expecting it at all, right? Jesus had been telling them, he'd been teaching them that I'm going to die and I shall return, right? He predicts it, he tells them, but they never fully understand this. So much so that it's not them who is fearful that something may happen, right? They were just going along with what was happening in that moment, right? But it was the Jewish leaders that even actually requested the securing of the tomb because they were afraid that something was actually going to happen. They had an understanding. They understood something might happen that day. So they're like, hey, seal that tomb and let's put some guards in front of it. We see that from Matthew 27 here, all right? None of the disciples really expected a resurrection that Sunday morning. In fact, even the real reason why the women went to the tomb on Sunday morning, it wasn't to check, right? It wasn't to check to see if Jesus was there. They were actually going there to anoint Jesus' body, right? They wanted to pour the oils on him. In the haste of what had happened on Friday and securing Jesus and putting him in the tomb, they put all the spices and everything on him, like 100 pounds of spices. They wrapped him, but they actually didn't put the oil, the anointing oil that is part of the process, of the embalming process. So the women actually came that morning. They come that morning, and what do they find, right? The stone is rolled away, and Jesus is gone. And even that, they struggle, right? Even with that, they struggle to understand. We see in Mark, right, that he says, even after the angel explained to them what had happened, they had fled from the tomb, right, trembling and afraid. John says that Mary thought someone stole the body, right? And then Luke adds that the women came and shared with the apostles about what had happened, and they didn't believe him either. They're like, these women are crazy. What are they talking about? They have no understanding. Because to them, of course, right, no one rises from the dead after 3 days. That's craziness. Sure, Jesus told them. Jesus told them all he was going to rise again. And they all thought they believed it. They all thought they understood. But when it push came to shove, they weren't ready for the miracle of all miracles, right? That's what Mark says. So when they heard he was alive and had been seen by her, they refused to believe it. Like a lot of this stuff was going on, and they're struggling through this understanding, right? And then Thomas is nowhere to be found during this time, right? John tells us that Thomas wasn't present on that Sunday evening. And then suddenly, when Jesus appears, he's not there that first time Jesus comes back to the disciples. And, there's some theories that people have. And I have one thought about that as well. And I think generally there's two types of people, right, that respond in these moments of tragedy and sorrow. There are verbal processors like myself that like to be in the midst of the group of people and surrounded by people in those moments of challenge and difficulty. It helps me to process things out with people. And I think maybe the disciples were like that. They were wondering what had happened. They were talking amongst themselves. They're working it out. I think Thomas is more, right, of an internal processor. He probably wanted the solitude and the quietness to really understand what had happened. All those things that he thought he believed and that he was told, right, were not happening. So Thomas wasn't there, right? And I think he's really trying to understand what has been going on. Because I think Thomas must have been truly devastated and deeply hurt, just like everybody else during that time, right? Because as we've seen, Thomas has this deep love for Jesus, right? He still wants to believe that Jesus is going to return, right? Because deep inside, he wants to believe that. He wants to know that, but he can't objectively understand all of that, right? He's in this place of despair, of heartache and struggle and challenge. He wants to believe it. He wants to believe it. But he's the one that's holding out. He's holding out for the evidence, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing. Because one thing you can say, right? It's like you can call Thomas a doubter, but he's definitely not an unbeliever, right? He is not an unbeliever. And I think sometimes historians and commentators have tried to put Thomas in this category of a skeptic, of someone that struggled so much with his own faith that he couldn't believe. I don't think Thomas is that, right? He's not a skeptic. He's not this rationalist, right? I think his doubts come from this true devotion of Jesus, wanting to fully understand and embrace everything that Jesus had gone through, right? He may have doubted the resurrection. Actually, he just wanted, I guess better stated, he wanted proof, concrete evidence that Jesus had risen. And he wanted him to know that for himself. Right? Because there are two types of doubters when it comes to spiritual truth, right? There's people that are absolutely just not going to believe, no matter what you say to them, no matter how you present it to them, no matter what arguments or evidence you give, they're hardliners, and they are not going to believe, right? They don't believe in God, they don't believe in Jesus, and there's nothing you're going to do or say absent a miracle from God that changes their heart, that allows them to come to believe. But there's other kinds of doubters, right? There's other kinds of people that have struggles in their heart about understanding the truth, right? It's the, I don't believe it now, but if you show me some proof, if you kind of come to me with some objective truth, I can see it for myself, and then I will believe. And that's the category that Thomas is actually in, right? He's not an unbelieving skeptic. Rather, he is a believer that is deeply hurt by what he went through and the struggles that he went through, and he wanted to actually believe in the miracles, and he wanted to believe in the miracle that Jesus had risen again. But this one for him was too big. It was too big just to take somebody else's word for it. And who could blame him, right? He wanted to see it for himself. He wanted to see it with his own eyes to really understand the truth. Like I said, in law, right, the most solid piece of evidence is eyewitness testimony, right? That you want an eyewitness, the person that actually saw it with their own eyes, to be able to testify to the truth or to the acts that had happened, right? Secondhand evidence is least persuasive, and it's unreliable and can be challenged just by any other evidence that comes in. And that's what Thomas wanted, right? He wanted this eyewitness evidence. He wanted to know this for himself, right? And then we see that Jesus ultimately has this deep love for Thomas, right? 8 days after Jesus appeared to the disciples the second time, this is time when Thomas is with them, right? And Jesus speaks to him because he understands that his faith was challenged and his faith was weak. And he says to him, right, reach here with your finger and see with my hands, and see my hands, and reach here with your hand and put your into my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believing. What an amazing thing that Jesus does for him, right? He's struggling. He is in this place of torment, of not understanding, and Jesus grants him exactly what he wanted. He came to him, and Thomas did the unthinkable and placed his fingers there, looked at him, put his finger in there. Can you imagine that moment? How powerful of a truth it must have become for him, right? That he struggled with this. He was in this place of doubt. And in that moment, in one moment, Jesus changed it all for Thomas. You know, there was a time I wanted this type of proof, not to this degree, but I remember going away on a personal prayer retreat. And one of the things I kept asking God as I was going there was like, yeah, I want to know that you are here with me. Like, God, like, just give me some, like, tangible evidence, this sign that I'm going to be spending the next 3 days in prayer. Like, please, just let me know that you are here with me. Right? And the place that I go to, it's actually in this amazingly beautiful place. It's in Rancho Palos Verdes. You walk, great place to go for a prayer retreat, right? You walk along this trail. It actually walks along this beach trail. You can walk all the way down to the beach if you want. But there's this bluff that you sit on, and there's this seat. And I was walking, and I was praying, and it was pretty early in the morning. No one was around me, and I was just there lost in prayer. You know, I had my earphones on, and I'm just worshiping and praying. And the thing that God kept saying to me over and over again was like, just trust me. Like, just love me. And I'm like, you know, and I keep hearing those words, and I keep saying, God, just show me that you're here. I want some proof that you're here. I need something I can hold on to get me through these 3 days, you know, because I was really searching for some answers for some different things that I was praying through. And I guess I must have been pretty loud when I was praying, because when like I said, I got to this spot, there was no one there. But then this lady, I didn't realize, taps me. And I take off my earbuds and I look, and she's like, you're kind of loud. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just praying. She's like, yeah, we know you're praying. And I'm like, okay, sorry about that. But the amazing thing is, like, remember what I said God kept telling me? It's trust me and love me. And then, this is the lady that tapped me, and if you look at her tattoo, it says love and trust very clearly, and it says loyalty, respect, and patience and endurance. It was like so amazing. I looked at her arm, and then I was like, oh my goodness, and then just the shock on my face, and she's like, looks at me like I'm strange. I'm like, do you mind if I take a picture of your arm? And she's like, oh, you like my tattoo? I'm like, yeah, it's a great tattoo. And then I kind of explained to her what I was praying. And this little thing, this little moment, right, of, you may think it's coincidence, you may think it's random that it happens, but, you know, in that moment, I found so much assurance. I found so much peace, and I found so much of my faith, like just like solidifying in that moment, right? This was God answering that exact thing that I wanted, was to allow me to know that he was there with me in that moment. And it was just an amazing kind of bit of evidence that I needed in that moment. And it just did so much for me. And that prayer retreat was just an amazing time from the rest of that 3 days that we were there. It just became this amazing moment for me. And in those moments, when you ask, right? When you ask God, I would encourage you, not that we're putting God to the test, right? You're not trying to challenge God. But sometimes I think we all need that type of assurance. We need that type of certainty that God is with us. I'm not saying that he's not, right? God is always with us. But it makes it so much sweeter when there's an objective piece of evidence that really shows you that he is there, right? And that's a little glimpse of what I believe Thomas must have felt, right? After he was able to actually see and touch and understand and confirm that that was Jesus, right? In that moment, that solidified his faith. It strengthened him in this amazing way, right? And gave him the strength he needed to continue to move forward, right? And then he answers, right? Because once Thomas saw for himself, he believed. He says, my Lord and my God, right? And Jesus said to him, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who do not see and yet believe. You know, all that God is asking us, all that he's asking from us is just to be consistent in ourselves, in our relationship with him, right? He wants us to give him the same benefit of the doubt that we do in other circumstances in our lives, right? To be able to trust him no matter what we're going through or no matter what the challenges may be, right? Because I think sometimes we struggle with different kind of doubt. We struggle with different kind of challenges, right? Yeah, maybe, I hope, that we don't struggle with the resurrection story. But maybe we struggle, right? And we doubt our own identity in God. Or we struggle, or we doubt that God is going to take me through this storm that I'm currently in. Or maybe I struggle and I doubt that God really loves me. Like, those are those things that we are struggling with in our own faith. And I think it's okay, right? It's okay that we struggle and we have these doubts. It's not the end of the world. Trust me, it's not the end of the world, because if it was, who would God really be, right? Who would he really be if he left us in that? Because I truly believe, right, that it is a wonderful truth that some of the greatest doubters even in the Bible, often became the strongest believers, right? They became the ones that did all those things that God called them to do, right? They probably wouldn't have believed it. These fishermen, right? The tax collector, would they really have believed that God was going to use them to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth? No, they struggled with it, and then they believed, and they walked with Jesus. And they were the first ones to start changing the world. And it's true of the church today. Some of the strongest and most adamant opposers of the gospel have become some of the most strongest believers and some of the most diligent and faithful men and women that have pushed the gospel far and wide. And I think that's why the story of Thomas is actually in the Bible, right? It's so that honest doubters might be encouraged, right, to bring their doubts to Jesus, right? Thomas did. Thomas did exactly that. And Jesus, in one moment, washed all those doubts away. You know, I wanted to share about Thomas and from his perspective to show us that there's many different people in this world, right? There are some in this room, and God bless you if you are, that you have a childlike faith, and you can just grasp onto that truth, and you could believe, and you hold on to it, and in your heart of hearts, you know it to be true. But there's many who are like Thomas, or you're like me, where I need to understand, I need to find the evidence, and I need to work through it. And even in those moments, right, it takes a little bit longer, and it's a little bit harder. But once that truth, that doubt solidifies into faith, into trust, it becomes so strong. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm not saying that. But some of us, I think most of us, a lot more of us at least, I think struggle in those ways as well. Because we have to understand, right? We truly understand that Jesus died. There's no doubt in that. But the second part of that is that he rose again, right? He rose again for each and every one of us, right? Because our Heavenly Father loves us so much that he sent his Son, not just to die for us, because he did that, but also that he would rise again, and all that call upon his name will be saved. Amen? So I ask you again, do you believe in miracles? Do you believe that God can perform miracles in your life? I truly pray that you do. And I want to encourage you, it's okay. It's okay to have doubt. It's okay to have doubt because it's natural and it's a very human response, right? But the only thing is we can't remain in that doubt. We can't sit and wallow in that doubt. Our focus at some point has to shift from the doubt and focus on Jesus, right? And we have to be able to get to that place of trust and of hope in the one, like I said, that loved us so much that he sent his Son to die for us. You know, Raymond Edmond said this very famous quote, "Never doubt in the dark what God told you in the light." And I think sometimes we struggle with that, right? Like we believe it, we see it, But in those moments of struggle, in those moments of challenge, and I know it's hard, and we all go through it, and sometimes it's hard to believe in those moments, but don't doubt it. Don't doubt it, right? And sometimes we have these doubts because I think it's like we don't think that God's plan for our lives is the right plan. Like we've made up all these plans, we've made up all these things that how we want to live our life and go about living our life. So we go through these things, right? Because we think our plan is better. Like God, yeah, I don't think this is the way I should be going, or this isn't what I should be doing. So we think God's plan is secondary to our plan. But we also see that God's plan, right, is the most important. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. God has a plan for each and every one of us, right? Whether you know that plan or not. And as it unfolds in your life, don't doubt it just because you don't understand it, right? Or don't try to change it because you think you have a better plan than God, right? In his own omniscient way, he leads that path for us. And I pray that any of you, right, that are really struggling in those moments or in those challenges, or you're wallowing in the struggles, that you would be set free from it. You'd be set free from that doubt that kind of holds you and grips you, and you're able to turn your eyes and really focus on Jesus, the object of our faith. This is how we move from doubt to the truth of who Jesus is in our lives. Amen?